I realized I wasn't invited the moment I saw the table had been set for 6, but there were only 5 proper plates. Mine was the one that didn't match. The porcelain was thinner, slightly chipped along the edge, and placed just a little too far from the others, like an afterthought someone hoped wouldn't be noticed. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, my hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, taking in the soft glow of the dining room lights, the polished wood, the low murmur of conversation that paused just briefly when I entered. "Oh, Margaret, you're here," Vanessa said, her smile bright, but her eyes already moving past me, as if I were just another item being checked off a list. I smiled back, the way I always did, and took my seat without saying a word. The chair felt slightly lower than the others. Maybe it wasn't, but it felt that way. Dinner carried on as if everything were perfectly normal. Daniel talked about work, something about a new client and longer hours, and Vanessa filled in the spaces with her usual polished ease, guiding the conversation like she was hosting a dinner party for strangers instead of family. I listened, nodding when expected, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap when I wasn't using my fork. No one asked me anything. Not about my week, not about the doctor's appointment I'd mentioned over the phone, not even about the pie I had brought, which sat untouched at the far end of the counter. I noticed the small things. The way Vanessa corrected Daniel when he misspoke, her voice soft but firm. The way he immediately adjusted, like it was second nature. The way she laughed just a second too loudly at her own remarks, glancing around the table to make sure everyone followed. And then, halfway through the meal, it happened. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. That would have been easier to respond to. Vanessa set her fork down gently, dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin, and said, almost casually, "You know, Margaret, we've been talking about making some changes around here. Downsizing things that don't really fit anymore." She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. I kept my expression calm, my posture straight, my eyes on my plate. "That sounds practical," I replied, my voice steady, as if we were discussing furniture or storage boxes. But inside, something shifted. Not broken, not shattered, just moved. Like a piece of furniture quietly being rearranged in a room you thought you knew by heart. Vanessa finally looked at me then, a small, satisfied curve to her lips, as if she had tested a boundary and found no resistance. Around the table, no one spoke. Daniel reached for his glass, avoiding my eyes. The silence stretched just long enough to say everything that needed to be said. I picked up my fork again and took another bite, even though I could no longer taste the food. Because in that moment, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. It wasn't the plate. It wasn't the chair. It wasn't even the words themselves. It was the certainty behind them. She thought I didn't see it. She thought I wouldn't understand what line she had just crossed. And for the first time in a very long time, I decided I would let her keep believing that. I stayed until the plates were cleared, until the quiet clinking of silverware against china faded into the background, and Vanessa began stacking dishes with the kind of careful efficiency that looked helpful on the surface, but carried an unspoken message underneath. A message that said everything in this house moved according to her rhythm now. Not mine, not even Daniel's, and certainly not the memory of what this family used to be. And I watched her for a moment as she carried my untouched pie toward the kitchen without asking if anyone wanted a slice, without even glancing in my direction, as if it had already been decided that what I brought no longer mattered. And I rose slowly from my chair, smoothing my hands over the fabric of my coat, the same coat I had worn for years, the one Daniel used to compliment when he was younger, before compliments became something he saved for other people. And I followed the sound of running water into the kitchen doorway where Vanessa stood. At the sink, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed, completely at ease in a space that once felt like it belonged to all of us. And I said softly, "You can leave that. I will take care of it." But she did not turn around right away. She let the water run a few seconds longer before answering. "It is fine, Margaret. I have it handled." And there was nothing rude in her tone, nothing that could be pointed to as disrespect. But there was a finality in it that made the room feel smaller, like there was less air to breathe, and I nodded even though she could not see me and stepped back into the hallway, realizing as I did that I had not been asked to stay longer, not invited for coffee, not included in whatever came after dinner. And when I reached the front door, Daniel appeared beside me, his hand already on his phone, his eyes flicking up just long enough to acknowledge my presence. "Do you need me to call you a ride, Mom?" he asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Just a question asked out of habit, and I shook my head. "No, I drove myself," I said. And there was a time when he would have walked me to the car without being asked, when he would have carried my bag even if it weighed almost nothing. But tonight he simply nodded and stepped aside, and I opened the door and felt the cool evening air brush against my face, a quiet contrast to the warmth I had expected inside. And as I walked down the short path to my car, I paused for just a moment, my hand resting on the roof, looking back at the house where the lights still glowed softly through the windows, where shadows moved behind curtains, where laughter would probably return the moment I was no longer within earshot. And I realized then that nothing that had happened tonight was sudden. Nothing was new. It had been building in small, almost invisible ways, in missed phone calls, in conversations that ended too quickly, in decisions made without including me, in subtle corrections and polite dismissals that I had chosen to overlook because it was easier to believe in the version of my family that existed in my memory. And I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine right away, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and for the first time I allowed myself to see the pattern clearly, not as a series of isolated moments, but as something deliberate, something consistent, something that had been shaping itself quietly while I was busy holding on to what used to be. And I exhaled slowly, not with anger, not even with sadness, but with a kind of calm that felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a room you did not know existed in your own home. And I started the car, pulling away from the curb without looking back again, because now that I had seen it, truly seen it, I knew I could not pretend otherwise, and more importantly, I knew I did not have to. I drove home in silence, the kind that settles deep in your chest rather than just filling the space around you. And when I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, watching the porch light flicker slightly the way it always had, the same soft yellow glow that used to feel like a welcome, like a promise that this house still held something steady and familiar. And I let myself remember the way Daniel used to run down those front steps when he was a boy, his shoes untied, his voice calling out before he even reached the car, asking what I had brought home, what we were going to have for dinner, as if every ordinary day carried a kind of excitement that did not need to be earned. And I stepped out of the car slowly, closing the door with more care than usual, as if the quiet itself needed to be protected. And when I walked inside, the air felt still, untouched, exactly as I had left it. No rearranged chairs, no moved dishes, no subtle shifts that told me someone else had been here deciding what stayed and what did not. And I placed my keys in the same bowl by the door, the one Daniel had given me years ago for Mother's Day, back when he still noticed the small things. And I moved through the house with a kind of deliberate calm, turning on the kitchen light, setting my purse down on the counter, and noticing how everything remained exactly where it belonged, not because someone allowed it, but because I had placed it there, because this space still answered to me. And I poured myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I leaned lightly against the counter, letting the quiet settle around me in a way that no longer felt empty but clear, almost clarifying. And I began to think back, not just to tonight, but to the past few years, to the first time Vanessa had rearranged the seating at a holiday dinner without asking, to the way she had started speaking on Daniel's behalf, as if it were natural, as if he needed translation even when his own voice was right there, to the small corrections, the gentle redirections, the moments that seemed insignificant on their own, but now lined up with a precision that felt anything but accidental. And I remembered a Sunday afternoon not long ago when I had called Daniel to ask if he wanted to come by, just for coffee, nothing elaborate. And he had hesitated for a second too long before saying they already had plans he could not quite explain, and I had accepted it. Of course I had, because that is what I had always done. I made space, I adjusted. I told myself that families change, that children grow, that priorities shift, and I convinced myself that distance was something that happened naturally, not something guided, not something shaped by a steady hand behind the scenes. And I set the glass down gently, realizing that what I had seen tonight was not a beginning. It was simply the first moment I chose to recognize it for what it truly was. And I walked into the living room, lowering myself into the chair by the window, the one that still faced the street, the one where I used to wait for Daniel to come home. And I looked out at the quiet neighborhood, the streetlights casting long, soft shadows across the pavement, and I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not even disappointment, but a kind of clarity that felt sharper than either, because it did not ask for anything. It did not expect change from anyone else. It simply showed me the truth as it had been all along, and for the first time, I understood that what had been taken from me was not done in a single moment. It had been done slowly, carefully, piece by piece, until I was left with a place at the table that was never truly mine. And now that I saw it clearly, I knew one thing with certainty: I would not be sitting in that seat again. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was restless, but because my mind had finally stopped avoiding the things it had quietly filed away for years. And sometime around 3 in the morning, I found myself walking back into the kitchen, turning on the small light above the stove, and opening the drawer where I kept old papers, not out of urgency, but out of a need to see something tangible, something that had not been rearranged by someone else's preferences. And I pulled out a thin folder, the one Daniel had once insisted I keep safe, the one he had handed me with both hands, his voice serious in a way that had surprised me at the time, saying, "Mom, this is important, just in case anything ever changes." And I had smiled back then, brushing it off, telling him nothing was going to change, that family did not work that way, that what we built stayed where it was. And I set the folder on the table now, running my fingers lightly over the edge before opening it, not rushing, not searching for anything specific, just allowing myself to look at the dates, the signatures, the careful way everything had been arranged. And I remembered the day we sat in that small office downtown, Daniel on one side, me on the other, the attorney explaining things in calm, measured terms about ownership, about future planning, about making sure everything was clear. And Daniel had nodded through most of it, occasionally glancing at me as if to make sure I understood, as if he was the one taking care of me now, and I had let him, because that is what mothers do. We allow the roles to shift without making a scene. We pretend it is natural, even when something about it feels slightly off. And I closed the folder slowly, not with regret, but with a quiet acknowledgement that the conversation had never truly been about clarity. It had been about positioning, about placing things in order long before I realized the order itself was changing. And I stood there for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the steady, predictable sound of something doing exactly what it was designed to do. And I thought about the way Vanessa had said those words at dinner, not asking, not suggesting, but stating, as if decisions had already been made somewhere else, somewhere I had not been invited to sit. And I walked to the window, looking out at the still dark street, and I began to see it more clearly. Not just her role in it, but Daniel's silence, his small hesitations, the way he no longer corrected her when she spoke for him, the way he allowed things to move forward without ever pausing to ask if I was part of that movement. And I realized that what had once been protection had slowly turned into permission, not granted in a single moment, but given little by little, until it no longer felt like a choice. And I did not feel anger when that thought settled in. I felt something steadier, something that did not ask me to react but to understand. And I turned off the kitchen light, carrying the folder with me into the living room, placing it carefully on the table beside my chair. And as the first hint of morning light began to touch the edges of the curtains, I understood that whatever came next would not begin at their table. It would begin here, in a space where nothing had been taken from me yet, where every decision still belonged to me. And for the first time, I was ready to use that. The morning unfolded quietly, not with urgency, but with intention, and I moved through my routine with a steadiness that felt different from the days before, as if each action now carried a purpose I had not acknowledged until now. And after a simple breakfast, I picked up the folder again, placing it carefully into my bag before heading out. The drive across town familiar in distance, but unfamiliar in meaning. Because this time I was not going somewhere out of habit or obligation. I was going because I had chosen to. And when I stepped into the office building downtown, the same one from years ago, the receptionist looked up with a polite smile that held no recognition, which was fine, because I was not here to be remembered. I was here to remember for myself. And when I gave my name, there was a brief pause, a quick glance at the computer screen, and then a nod. "Of course, Mrs. Collins, he will be with you shortly." And I took a seat, folding my hands in my lap, listening to the muted sounds of phones ringing and quiet conversations behind closed doors, and I realized how different this silence felt compared to the one at that dinner table. This one was neutral, unclaimed, not filled with unspoken expectations, and when the door finally opened, it was not the same attorney from before, but someone younger, composed, professional, who greeted me with a firm handshake and led me into a small office where everything was neatly arranged, nothing out of place, nothing decided without documentation. And as I sat down, I placed the folder on the desk between us, not pushing it forward right away, just letting it rest there. And he waited, giving me the space to speak when I was ready. And when I finally did, my voice was calm, clearer than I expected. "I would like to review everything," I said, not asking, not suggesting, simply stating. And he nodded, opening the folder with care, flipping through the pages, explaining what each document meant now, not then, how time and circumstance could shift interpretation, how certain protections existed that I had never needed to use, how some decisions could still be adjusted if done correctly. And I listened without interrupting, absorbing each word, not as something overwhelming, but as something clarifying, something that finally gave structure to what I had been feeling without fully understanding. And at one point he paused, looking up at me with a question in his eyes, not about the documents, but about the reason behind them. And I met his gaze without hesitation. "Things have changed," I said simply, and he nodded again, not asking for details, because he did not need them. The papers spoke enough, and as the meeting continued, I began to see the shape of what was possible, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that demanded confrontation, but in a way that allowed control to return quietly, piece by piece, through choices that were mine to make. And when it was over, I signed nothing yet. I agreed to nothing final. I simply gathered the folder again, thanking him for his time, and as I stood to leave, he added one sentence, measured and neutral: "It is always better to act before decisions are made for you." And I gave a small nod in return, stepping back into the hallway, feeling the weight of those words settle not as pressure, but as confirmation. And when I walked out into the daylight, the air felt different, not lighter, but clearer, as if something that had been quietly closing around me had finally opened just enough for me to step through. And for the first time since that dinner, I did not feel like I was reacting to what had happened. I felt like I was preparing for what would happen next, and more importantly, I knew that whatever came, it would not catch me unaware again. The days that followed did not look different from the outside, and that was exactly how I intended it to be, because nothing unsettles a carefully built illusion more than the absence of resistance. And I moved through my routine with the same quiet precision, answering Daniel's occasional messages with polite brevity, accepting his suggestion for another dinner later that week without hesitation. And when I arrived this time, I noticed the same table, the same arrangement, the same subtle imbalance that had once made me pause. But now I simply took my seat without examining it, without giving it the power it once held. And Vanessa greeted me with that same practiced warmth, her voice light, her posture relaxed, as if nothing had shifted, as if she believed the previous evening had settled something rather than revealed it. And I watched her carefully, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but in the small details, the timing of her words, the way she directed the flow of conversation, the moments she chose to include me and the moments she did not. And I began to understand her rhythm more clearly, not as something personal, but as something strategic, something that depended on consistency, on the assumption that I would continue to respond as I always had. And Daniel, for his part, followed that rhythm. Without question, his responses aligning with hers in a way that no longer felt coincidental. And at one point during the meal, he mentioned a future plan, something about renovating part of the house, expanding a room, making better use of the space, and Vanessa added, almost seamlessly, "It makes sense to start thinking long-term, especially with how things are structured now." And there it was again, that same phrasing, that same quiet certainty that decisions had already begun forming. Without me, and I nodded slightly, taking a sip of water, allowing the conversation to move past me without interruption, because now I understood that speaking into it would not change its direction, not yet. And later, as the evening settled into its usual pattern, I stood in the kitchen for a brief moment, watching Vanessa organize the counters with efficient ease, and I said, You have made this place very functional. Choosing the word carefully, and she smiled, glancing over her shoulder. That is the goal, to make sure everything serves a purpose, she replied, and I held that sentence for a moment longer than necessary, because it confirmed something important, something she believed without question, that everything, and perhaps everyone, had a place defined by usefulness, and I inclined my head slightly, offering a small smile in return. Of course, I said, my voice even, and I left it at that, because there was no need to challenge it now, no need to correct her. Understanding, not when I had already begun shaping something she could not see, and when I left that evening, the air felt familiar again, not because anything had returned to what it was, but because I had finally stepped outside the role they had quietly written for me. And as I drove home, I did not replay the conversation, I did not analyze each word, I simply allowed the silence to settle around me, knowing that for the first time, I was not reacting to their decisions, I was waiting, patiently, for the moment when mine would matter more. The shift did not happen all at once, and that was what made it invisible to them, because from the outside, nothing I did could be described as resistance, nothing could be pointed to and labeled as defiance. And yet, piece by piece, I began to reclaim something that had quietly slipped away, starting with the smallest decisions, the ones no one notices until they begin to matter. And one afternoon, I walked through my house with a notebook in hand, not rushing, not reacting, simply observing, writing down what belonged to me, what I had built, what I had maintained, not in a sentimental way, but in a practical one, because sentiment had never protected anything. And as I moved from room to room, I realized how much of my life had been organized around giving without measure, without condition, and how little of it had been documented in a way that anyone else would recognize as structure. And I sat down at the dining table, my table, the one that had never required permission to use, and I began to make a series of quiet decisions, not dramatic ones, not irreversible ones, just clear ones. And later that week, I returned to the office. Downtown, the same calm hallway, the same neutral tone, and this time, I did not hesitate when the documents were placed in front of me. I read each line carefully, not because I doubted them, but because I wanted to understand them fully, and when I signed, it was not with emotion, not with anger or relief, but with a steady hand that reflected something much simpler, certainty. And when I left, I did not feel triumphant. I felt aligned, as if something that had been slightly out of place had finally been set back where it belonged, and I did not announce any of it, not to Daniel, not to Vanessa, because there was no need. What had changed did not require their acknowledgement to be real, and when Daniel called a few days later, his tone casual, asking if I would be coming by for dinner again, I agreed without hesitation, my voice as even as it had always been, and when I arrived, the evening unfolded in the same familiar pattern, the same table, the same careful arrangement, the same quiet assumptions moving beneath the surface, and Vanessa greeted me with her usual composure, unaware that anything had shifted beyond what she could see, and I took my seat, noticing the plate, the chair, the distance, but this time, it registered only as detail, not as meaning. And during the meal, Daniel mentioned another plan, something about timing, about how certain changes would be easier if everything stayed predictable, and Vanessa nodded, adding her agreement in that smooth, practiced way, and I listened, not because I needed to understand their plans anymore, but because I wanted to see how far they would go in believing those plans were already settled. And at one point, Vanessa turned to me, her tone light, almost conversational. "We just want to make sure everything is as simple as possible moving forward," she said, and I met her gaze for a brief moment, offering a small, polite smile. "Simplicity can be very effective," I replied, my voice calm, measured, and I let the words rest there, knowing they would be interpreted exactly as she expected, because she still believed I was speaking within the boundaries she had drawn, and the conversation moved on. The evening continued. And when I left, nothing outward had changed, no confrontation, no raised voices, no visible shift in the balance they thought they controlled. And as I drove home, I realized that the most important part of what I had done was not what they would eventually discover. It was what they had not noticed at all, because for the first time, I was no longer waiting for a place at their table. I had already decided where I would stand. The next move did not require speed. It required precision, and I approached it the same way I had approached everything else since that night, quietly, deliberately, without drawing attention to the fact that anything was changing. And over the following week, I made a series of small adjustments that, on their own, would seem insignificant to anyone watching from the outside. I updated contact information, confirmed details that had not been reviewed in years, ensured that certain accounts reflected exactly what they were meant to reflect, not what someone else might have assumed they would become, and each step was handled with the same calm professionalism I had encountered at the office. No urgency, no emotion, just clarity, and I found that the more precise I became, the less I felt the need to revisit the conversations at that table, because they no longer held the same weight. They were not decisions, they were assumptions, and assumptions only carry power when they go unchallenged, and I was no longer allowing that, not in a confrontational way, but in a way that made those assumptions irrelevant before they could fully form. And a few days later, I invited Daniel to stop by, not for a formal discussion, not for anything that would raise suspicion, just a simple visit, the kind that used to be routine. And when he arrived, he looked slightly surprised, as if stepping into this house required an adjustment he had not expected, and I welcomed him in the same way I always had, offering coffee, asking about his work, listening without interruption as he spoke about schedules and plans and things that filled his time now. And for a while, everything felt almost familiar, almost unchanged, until there was a brief pause, a natural break in the conversation, and he glanced around the room, his eyes lingering for a moment on the table, the same table that had once held every version of our family without question, and he asked, casually, "Have you thought any more about what we talked about the other night?" And I met his gaze with a calm expression, not avoiding the question, not reacting to it either, simply acknowledging it. "I have been taking care of a few things," I said, my voice even, and he nodded, accepting the answer without pressing further, because there was nothing in my tone that invited challenge, nothing that suggested uncertainty, and we moved on to other topics, lighter ones, easier ones, and when he left, there was a moment at the door where he hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more, but did not quite know how, and I simply offered him a small smile, the kind that does not demand explanation, and watched as he stepped outside, closing the door behind him, and as the house settled back into its quiet rhythm, I realized that the most significant part of what I was doing was not what I had already completed, but what I had set in motion, because now, when the moment came, it would not feel sudden to me. It would not feel like a reaction. It would feel like a continuation of something that had been carefully arranged long before anyone else realized it existed. And I moved through the rest of the day with that understanding, not anticipating conflict, not preparing for confrontation, simply allowing everything to align as it needed to, because the truth was, I no longer needed to prove anything at their table. I only needed to be ready when the time came for them to understand what I had already decided. It happened on an ordinary evening, the kind they had carefully preserved as routine, predictable, controlled, and when I arrived, nothing appeared different at first, the same soft lighting, the same table set with deliberate symmetry, the same quiet confidence in the way Vanessa moved through the room, as if everything already belonged to her vision of what it should be, and I took my seat without hesitation, noticing once again the subtle placement of my plate, the distance that had once carried meaning but now felt like a detail that no longer applied to me. And the conversation began as it always did, Daniel speaking about plans, Vanessa refining them with that steady precision, shaping each idea into something that sounded inevitable, and I listened, allowing the rhythm to continue uninterrupted, because this time, I knew exactly where it was leading, and halfway through the meal, Daniel set his glass down and cleared his throat slightly, a small signal that something had been rehearsed. "Mom, we wanted to talk to you about the house," he began, his tone careful, measured, and Vanessa followed smoothly. "We think it would be best if we start making some long-term decisions now, before things become complicated." And there it was, spoken openly now, not hinted at, not layered beneath polite phrases, but presented as something already agreed upon, something they expected me to accept without resistance. And I let a brief silence settle over the table, not long enough to create discomfort, just long enough to allow the words to fully exist, and then I reached into my bag, not quickly, not dramatically, simply with the same calm movement I had used all evening, and I placed a thin envelope on the table between us, aligning it neatly with the edge of my plate, and both of them looked at it, then at me, the first hint of uncertainty breaking through the confidence they had carried into this conversation, and I met their gaze evenly, my voice quiet but clear. "I have already taken care of that," I said, and Daniel frowned slightly, confusion replacing the certainty in his expression. "What do you mean?" he asked, and I gave a small, composed smile, the kind that does not invite interruption. "I mean that the decisions regarding this house, and everything connected to it, have already been reviewed and finalized," I replied, and Vanessa's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her hand stilling against the table as she processed the words, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice tightening just enough to reveal the first crack in his composure. "Finalized how?" he asked, and I slid the envelope a few inches closer to them, not pushing it, simply making it available. "You can read it if you would like," I said, and for a moment, neither of them moved, because the situation they had prepared for no longer existed, and when Daniel finally reached for the envelope, his movements were slower than before, less certain, and as he opened it, scanning the pages inside, the silence that followed was no longer controlled, it was unsettled, unfamiliar, and Vanessa leaned slightly toward him, her eyes moving quickly across the document, searching for something that would restore the balance she had assumed was hers. But it was not there, and I watched them both with the same calm attention I had given everything else, not with satisfaction, not with anger, simply with clarity, because this moment was not about taking anything from them. It was about returning something to myself, and when Daniel finally looked up, his expression no longer held the quiet confidence from earlier, it held something else, something closer to realization, and I inclined my head slightly, my voice steady, unchanged. "You see, simplicity can be very effective," I said, and I let the words rest there, not as a challenge, not as a victory, but as a fact they could no longer ignore, and I picked up my glass, taking a slow sip of water, as the weight of what they had not seen settled fully into the room.